So welcome back to the Roots of Wisdom. Today we are going to be exploring this magnificent sage who for hundreds and hundreds of years was regarded as the wisest of all beings, Pythagoras. If you look at this image, which I have chosen as a central image for this entire class, the School of Athens, which was painted by Raphael and stands in the room known as the Room of the Signature in the Vatican Museum, where popes signed important documents. And this fresco towers over us. It takes up an entire wall. At its heart is a summary of the philosophy of the ancient world. And as we're going to discover today, the person who is at the heart of this picture, though not at the center, is Pythagoras himself. Now, we've been tracing in this class so far these hidden roots that come together to create the religion of Christianity. Most of us in the Western world understand that Christianity is built upon the roots of Judaism, with the stories of the Hebrew Bible that become the New Testament of the Christian Bible. Those are signified in this image by Perugino by those 6 prophets, those figures of the Old Testament, including David and Solomon. But what we've really been exploring is that there's this hidden mother as well. And the hidden mother is exemplified by the Greek pagan prophetic women, the Sibyls. And it's these 2 streams that come together. The Greek stream also includes philosophy. Philosophia is actually a word that means the love of Sophia, the love of wisdom, which was personified in the ancient Greek world by a female figure, the love of wisdom. So those sages who we revere as philosophers were those who were somehow connected to this deep and mystical stream of wisdom. Pythagoras was actually the first person who described himself as a lover of wisdom, a philosopher, a philosoph, who then created a foundation of learning that was passed on from generation to generation to generation. Now, the love of learning, the search for wisdom, and as we're going to explore in particular, a Pythagorean approach to life, flourished throughout the world. It became the foundation for what was known as the Serapeum, which was in Alexandria, this amazing place that housed not only schools of science and astronomy, but was also a religious temple, which also had a museum, a place for the muses of art and history and poetry and music. And this place in Egypt, in Alexandria, is another one of those layers of spiritual archaeology. And if we dig deeply enough, we are going to find Pythagoras at the roots of that. In fact, in Alexandria, Egypt, there was in fact early Christian communities, one that traced its roots back to a disciple known as Salome. The female disciple Salome actually passed on a whole community that had 4 altars. One altar was for Jesus, one altar was for Plato, one altar was for Aristotle, and one was for Pythagoras. They were a community that considered themselves Christians, but continued to celebrate the Eleusinian mysteries, which we'll discuss next week. So it's fascinating to see all of these threads coming together in very different ways. And as we're going to see when we end up our class today at Chartres Cathedral in France, the unlikely companions of Jesus and Pythagoras are carved in stone together. Now, most of us only know Pythagoras by being tortured by him in geometry class and having to memorize that theorem that bears his name, the Pythagorean theorem of a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And I don't know about you, but when I first learned this, I thought this was so dry and so boring and so dusty, and I had no idea that hidden and buried within it was a whole world that was connected to magic, Because Pythagoras was not just a mathematician, the way that we think of number crunchers or accountants being mathematically inclined. In fact, in the time that Pythagoras lived, and in his life, in his works, and in his legacy, mathematics and magic and music and religion were all one thing. It wasn't fragmented and cut up into little bits. And so this great sage from the 6th century BC that we tend to only know by this little tiny formula was actually the foundation of Western music and musical theory, an amazing astronomer who prefigured the discoveries of Kepler and Copernicus by 2,000 years, a philosopher and a poet, a charismatic religious figure who eventually becomes imagined as a shaman and even a demigod. And boy, if you had told me that when I was 14, I would have paid a heck of a lot more attention in math class. He was actually regarded as the origin of the entire Platonic tradition, according to Aristotle and later authors. So if you like Platonic philosophy, imagine that that is coming out as a trunk. But the roots are Pythagoras. In fact, Aristotle credits him on one of his works by saying, most people, all in fact, who regard the whole heaven as finite, say that it lies at the center, but the Italian philosophers, known as the Pythagoreans, take the contrary view. At the center, they say, is fire, and the earth creates night and day by its circular motion about the center. Oh, the things Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans knew. Charles Kahn, in his rather brilliant book, A Brief History that's only about 380 pages, says that the founding father for mathematics, music, astronomy, and philosophy, credited with inventing the very notion of philosophy, the first description of nature as a cosmos, or ordered whole, credited with discovering the sphericity of the earth, developing the theory of proportionals in mathematics, identifying the five regular solids, discovering the numerical ratios that underlie basic musical concordance. He was the greatest scientific mind of early Greece, if not of all antiquity. And in fact, in successive generations, the Romans, when they were told that they needed to erect a statue to the wisest of all human beings, had in the very center of their forum for 200 years the statue of Pythagoras. Now, the stories about Pythagoras and his life are really slippery, because we can't actually pin anything down. There are some extraordinary parallels actually to Jesus in the fact that neither one of them ever wrote a word. Well, actually, we're told that Jesus wrote something in sand, but we're never told what it was, so we don't know what the writing actually was, if it was a symbol or a word. But Pythagoras himself taught through an oral tradition. And so it was only centuries later that the Pythagorean sayings were actually written down, and only about 150 years after his life that we get his biography. And one of the things that's fascinating about his biography is that as the centuries unfurl and as the stories are told in different places, whether they are in Italy or whether they are in the Mesopotamian lands or whether they're in Egypt, the stories start to shift and change and take on other characteristics. So, as Joseph Campbell was so fond of saying, all of it is true. And some of it might have even happened. So with the story of Pythagoras himself, even his name has two different stories to it. And both of them connect to the Pythia. The Pythia was actually the most famous female oracle of the ancient world. We've already talked about the Sibyls, and particularly about the Sibyl of Cumae. But the Pythia was the oracle that was at Delphi. And this site was an incredibly important site that was a shrine that had both Apollo and Dionysus, two Greek gods that represented very different things. And we know of some of the oracular statements of Delphi because of Socrates, for example. That very famous maxim, know thyself, that we were taught, that was a Socratic saying, came about when the great sage came to Delphi. And inscribed on the walls between these two statues, one of Apollo and one of Dionysus, was this maxim, know thyself. And it also had a second part, never leave the middle, which I love. If you think of these two opposites, Apollo, Dionysus, reason and the irrational, to know thyself, to know both of those parts, and to never leave the middle. That has a deep symbolic significance for what we're going to describe about Pythagorean philosophy, which was at its heart about holding the tension of the opposites. So the Pythia that you see here was sitting on the tripod as the fumes came up from the underworld to go into a rapturous state of communion with the god Apollo, where she would then utter these sentences, sometimes inscrutable, that took a whole college of priests to translate what she was saying. And the two versions of Pythagoras' name, the first one is that his father came on a journey to meet the Pythia. And she went into one of her wild frenzies and prophesied that he would have a son who would be the wisest of all mortals, whose fame would never die. So when he had a son, he decided to name him Pythagoras in honor of the Pythia. The pith has that root that was related to the python, the snake that was said to be decomposing, that Apollo had killed here at this site. The other version of his name is that his mother was actually a Pythia at one point, and this is a later, more fanciful legend. But either way, I like the story that he's connected with this place that was a center of pilgrimage presided over by two very different principles: reason, order, balance, Apollo, and wild ecstasy and the irrational world, Dionysus. And that somehow his name points to integration of things that we would see as opposites. And that becomes very, very significant when we look at Pythagorean philosophy. It's said that he traveled the entire world for decades, being initiated into the different sites and centers of wisdom in the ancient worlds. So it's said that he traveled to Egypt, and there, while he was there, he learned all about the hieroglyphic symbols. He went into what was known as the Hermopolis, a temple dedicated to Thoth. He had mystic visions. He met the Chaldeans. He studied the interpretation of dreams with the Hebrews. He went on this pilgrimage to every site of wisdom, in some stories even encountering Zoroaster himself and collecting in his memory basket the wisdom of all these different traditions. And then it is said that upon midlife, at one point, he took all of those gleanings that he had, and he retired back in Samos in a cave, a land of his birth. And here he went into a profound meditative silence, where it was like all of these little pieces started to coalesce and come together and find a place of integration. The wisdom of Egypt, the wisdom of the Hebrews, the wisdom of all of these sites coming together, and in a state of silence and deep meditation, he rested. I love this image. This is Pythagoras emerging from the underworld by Salvatore Rossi. And you can see everyone ecstatically greeting him. And there he is coming out of the cave. Now that idea of the cave, those of you who are scholars of Plato should feel a little palpitation in your heart right now, because of course the great myth of Plato's philosophy is that we are all chained and shackled in a cave, and it is only gradually, progressively, that we begin to disentangle from the illusions, that we mistake shadows flickering on the wall for reality. And gradually, bit by bit, we begin to emerge from this cave to be able to see things as they really are, to come out into the light of day, to behold true forms and truth in all of its glory. I want you to hold on to that as we talk about this legend of Pythagoras being literally in a cave and then coming out, where he then begins to share his wisdom. Now, Pythagoras, in his travels, may well have gone eastward and encountered the ancient religions of the East, and Hinduism in particular, and the yogic traditions, because we find then in his philosophy this idea that the soul is eternal and that it will repeat lifetimes and come back in different incarnations in a process of gradual evolution. He called this metempsychosis, or the transmigration of the souls. And he took as a spiritual practice this idea that if we can become aware of enough, not only will we remember the details of our lives now, but also the details of lives in the past. This was part of his philosophy. Eventually, he took all of these wisdom strands and he created this astonishing braid. And this braid was a community that then began in southern Italy. They were a community of seekers of wisdom, of philosophers. And the Pythagorean community that developed then, circa 539 BCE in southern Italy, was a rather extraordinary community, because the central metaphor that they lived by was this idea that all of creation, all the cosmos, was interwoven with itself, and that we are parts of this. And what happens is that as human beings, we sometimes get out of tune. And the entire spiritual life was, what do we need to do in order to live in such a way that we are in harmony, that we are in tune with our deepest essence, and also in tune with nature all around us. So the entire community was dedicated to developing a way of spiritual practice that would tune the soul like a great violin, And this was the rhythm of their days. They gathered together in silence, and they were seeking to celebrate the oneness of all creation. And the sun was a central metaphor for this, an organizing principle. So as the sun rose each day, the community would gather in silence, and then they would sing the sun up as it rose. Throughout the day, they would go to their different tasks of study and work. The practice of silence was essential, because silence was thought to tune the soul most deeply, just as his years of silence had tuned them. And then they would gather together in the evening times to listen to the great lectures. Our very word auditor, people who listen as students but don't ask any questions and don't take any tests, actually comes from the Pythagorean community. The auditores were those who listened to the words of the great master. After years of being a listener, it might be deemed that you were ready for the next step to go more deeply into your studies. At that point, you went from being exoteric, outside the circle, to being esoteric, inside the circles. You see all the cool words we get from Pythagoras? So as an esoteric student then, you would actually be able to see the master as well as listen to him. Before that, there was a curtain, a veil between you and the teacher. But now you could go behind the veils. Now, part of the initiation, according to some of the sources, was 5 years of silence. I think we would have a hard time keeping 5 hours of silence for most of us in our modern world, or 5 days, or 5 months, let alone for 5 years. But the process of silence was so that you would watch the patterns of your mind, so you could hear and discern all the little chattering voices, to be able to say, oh, that's not real, oh, that's not real, oh, that's not real, to find what was really true. The silence was also a practice to make you pay deeper attention to things. And I don't know, I hope all of you have had the great experience of wandering through the woods and not talking, and then you can see things so much more vividly. So to be able to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, it was thought that you must zip the mouth for 5 years. And then it was thought that you would be ready to really begin the deepest levels of study. There were 2 of these circles of students in the Pythagorean communities once you got to the esoteric level. There were those that were known as the acousmata, according to some sources, and what they did is that they studied the sayings of the great master. According to other traditions, it was the mathematikoi, from which we get the mathematically inclined. So much of this is cloaked in secrecy. We have speculation, some of it which is pretty wildly different across many, many, many centuries about what really went on in those esoteric circles. But we know a couple things that we can say for certain. One of them is that the Pythagoreans were ardent vegetarians. They believed in the sanctity of all life. A second was that there was a profound emphasis on gender equality. Both men and women were allowed to become initiates into the inner circle and were treated with the same kind of reverence, which was astonishing in the 6th century BC, for women to be held at the same level. We know that their practice then consisted of the study of philosophy, but more than anything else, that philosophy was dedicated to the idea of finding what they called the logos, the logic, or the pattern that permeated the universe in all things. So the great question for them was, how? How can we see the divine? Can I learn how to see the DNA of God in mathematical formulas, in geometry, in the pattern of the stars, in the sounds of music, in nature all around me? And it was this quest for the divine pattern of the cosmos, a word he is also credited with inventing, that infused the communities of the Pythagoreans. Now, some of the things about them are pretty interesting in the sense that when they came together as a community, they gave all their property to be held in common. If at any point they decided to leave the community, they would be given twice what they had been put in. Isn't that an interesting detail? And every day, at the end of the day, they began and ended with music. But at the very end of the day, as they fell into sleep and silence, they were encouraged to reflect, to remember, to go through a moral inventory and ask themselves the question of where, I'll put it in a phrase, where was I in alignment, in tune with the world, and where was I out of tune with the world? What did I forget today? What did I forget to do? Where was I most in harmony with the world around me? So it was a process that was very ascetic and extremely disciplined in their way of life. Disciplined in diet, disciplined. Some of the reports sound like they gathered together to do what we might think of as yoga, physical exertion. But they also had a celebratory spirit. They would dance together, they would sing together, and they would go for long walks in silence in the woods and in the land. And all of those practices were just as important in tuning the soul as in studying, in reading books, in debating philosophy. I don't know about you, but for me, that's an incredibly attractive way of life that seeks to find a balance of what it is to be human. So we see these images of him teaching, of him reading, of him saying these sayings which are very inscrutable and have been debated over the centuries about what is the true meaning of each of these sayings. And then revering the principle of silence throughout, that it was through silence that part of us comes into deepest attunement. Now, the other practice that is inextricably linked to Pythagoras from the very beginning of the stories that were told of him is the study of music. And we have such a small little view of what music is. We have trivialized music so often in our culture as being entertainment, as the thing that you listen to in the background, as the thing that's in the elevator or when you're on hold. It permeates our world everywhere, but we see it as being something to distract ourselves very often. In the ancient Greek world, music was the ordering principle of the universe. It was actually this tremendously vital force that would shape and mold your moral character. It was thought that the sound vibrations that you listened to could make you a good person or could send you on a road towards sloth and rage and moral dissolution. And it's not just the words. It's not like we focus when we talk about morality and music these days on what the lyrics are of something. But in the ancient Greek world, it was actually the vibrational sounds that you used. Now, music was so important in the ancient world that those people who were the priests of Apollo, the god of healing, had to have 7 years of music study before they could become essentially a doctor. Imagine going to the hospital and every single doctor that you see had to have 7 years of musical study to get their medical license. That's how important it was. In our own time, it would be seen as important as chemistry or biology to study music, because music was seen then not just as entertainment, but as something that could be used to heal you. And the stories of Pythagoras all coalesce about his capacity to use sound and sound vibration and music to heal and to change, to shift the world, and to shift consciousness. Now, in our modern world, we tend to only have 2 scales, a major scale and a minor scale. Again, we've shrunk the possibilities. But in the ancient Greek world, you had many, and each scale was associated with a planet, with a god, with a mood, with the organs of the body. There were concordances, correspondences between all of these. And in the ancient world, if you were suffering in mind, body, or spirit, you would go to one of these temples that were known as the Asclepion. And they were named after this figure, Asclepius, and we still see Asclepius's staff when we go to the hospital or the ER room. That idea of the staff with a snake, remember Python, Pythagoras, curled around it. And here, when you would go there, suffering in mind, body, or spirit, you would present yourself. You would hope to incubate a dream that would catalyze something and would also be used for your diagnosis. So when you went to your doctor would say, well, tell me your ailments. Now tell me your dream. And then they would give you a prescription that included both medicinal herbs, but they would also give you a prescription that included music. Music therapy was an essential part of the healing process. Now, those scales that we base music on then, they had a whole system that you can see here of music therapy. The very word therapist comes from an ancient word therapeut, which means the attendant to the gods. The one who listens to the gods and waits on the gods and is the bridge between the world of the divine and the human. That is a therapeut or therapist. And music therapy then was associated with all of these different categories, different moods, different ideas. And almost like homeopathy, if you were suffering from a particular malady, You would be given a treatment that would match where you were in the moment. If you were suffering from depression, there was a scale for depression. And they would send you into a sound chamber where the music was being played in this mode, and then they would what's called modulate, gradually bring you out of the darkness into the light. If you were suffering from mania and excitation, you would start with music that was very exciting and then modulate into something that was more peaceful and calm. And there are great stories of Pythagoras and his ability to do this. One of the most famous ones of the legends is that he encountered a man who was absolutely enraged because he felt like his girlfriend had been cheating on him. So he was determined he was going to burn down the house of this couple, and he was there and he was ready with a hammer, with a torch, with everything, and he's and Pythagoras, in one version of the story, picks up a lyre and a harp and he begins to play. And as he plays, the music matches the ferocity of this disturbed individual, but transforms and eventually becomes calm. And so he puts down his tools of violence and walks away. So these musical modes that are so important in the life of the Greek community, I want to demonstrate so that we just have a feeling, a way into it. They're not going to be quite correct, by the way. They're going to be slightly out of tune because this modern instrument and modern music in general, as we're going to talk about, has some imperfections that have been built in since about the 15th century. But they're close enough that we can get a little taste, a little flavor for what these sounded like. So there were a couple of modes that were thought to be particularly important. And if you play on the piano, you can use the white keys to discover these and just go from one white key to the next. So most of the time in our music, we have either a major scale or a minor scale. And almost all of the music that we listen to, whether it's pop music or rock music or classical music, is based on one of those two scales, with about 80% being major based in our world today. But the ancient Greeks had other scales, for instance, Phrygian. What does that feel like to you? This was said to be a very mystic key. It was particularly suited for passion, boldness, and courage. So it has a very different feeling, doesn't it, than a major key piece. The one that was associated with Apollo, nobility and virtue, is known as Dorian. To be excellent to sing in the morning, to listen to, because it would create a sense of mental clarity, a sense of well-being, equanimity, poise, and clarity for that. There were others that were used. This one is Aeolian. When you listen to this Then there were ones that were more filled with sunshine, if you will. Here's Mixolydian. What a different soundscape. It's like different colors. Then there was Lydian. This one was thought to be a little dangerous because it might make you inclined to too much romance. Now there were certain modes that were thought to be quite dangerous, though, dangerous to the psyche. And those were ones like Locrian that would create disharmony in the individual. To get a real sense of the flavor of these modes, I found it to be extremely helpful to listen to a familiar song and to transpose that into the different modes. So let's start with one of the most famous songs of all. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and let's hear what this would have sounded like in the different modes. So the mode that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all agreed was a noble and virtuous mode, the Dorian mode, sounds like this. Notice how that makes you feel when you listen to that. Also good was that Phrygian mode. Although it could be inclined to too much passion, sometimes it was very good for mystic vision. Notice how differently your body feels listening to that. Really a different experience, right? Let's do that Lydian mode. Very different, right? Very different feeling. The Locrian, the one that was dangerous, thought that it could drive you insane. Let's listen to what that sounded like. Oh, I see all of these faces crunched in distress. But there was one mode that was worse than the Locrian. It was thought to lead you into moral depravity and sloth and torpor and utter laziness, and it would just erode the entire moral fiber of your being. I'm going to play it for you, this dangerous mode. Oh my goodness, what we have as C major was thought to be actually the road to perdition by Socrates and Aristotle. It would untune your soul from virtue. It would send you into a place where you could no longer be in harmony with the cosmos. And that is 80% of what we listen to in our world. I am dying to do an experiment, or have someone do an experiment, of going into a juvenile detention facility and simply changing all of the music to the modes that Plato and Aristotle thought would cultivate a sense of peace, tranquility, and moral virtue. I wonder what would happen after 30 days of Dorian therapy. So these modes, these worlds that were here, that were part of that, was all an element of what the Pythagoreans were studying. They were singing and playing music in the different modes according to what would tune the soul, to tune the soul. And the Pythagoreans as well then also were looking for patterns in the cosmos, and part of their curriculum, part of the school itself, involved this equality between men and women. Now, the pattern that they were searching for, the logos pattern, was not just a mathematical formula, but something that you could see in everything around. And as we look at this painting, the School of Athens, I will tell you that the entire painting is built on these divine patterns. Now, in that community of the Pythagoreans then, his wife, Theano, had a very important role. She was said to have led the community after his death. She was then a mathematician, but she was also a child psychologist and an ethicist. And it is to her that we have credited the discovery of one of the great mathematical formulas that is at the center of the art of the Renaissance. Now, we will find throughout certain documents through the Middle Ages these intriguing little illuminations of a woman with a compass teaching geometry. And this is not just an allegory then, this is actually a lived reality in the Pythagorean world, that women were esteemed as mathematicians. And it is to Theano that we have credited then the discovery of one of the most important relationships known as phi, or the golden mean. This particular ratio of A and B, when you see this, mathematically it forms what is known as the golden mean or the golden spiral. And it is a ratio that we find embedded everywhere in nature. So that 1.618 number that some of you may have had to learn at some point in math class finds its great expression in the cosmos around it. We see it in fractal geometry. We see it in the proportional unfolding of shells. We see it in the ratio of butterflies' wings. We see that number in its relationship about the rings around the planets. Over and over again in the bodies of the human being, in the unfolding of the petals of flowers, this golden spiral, this mathematical number, was not a dry and dusty number. It was the DNA of the divine. It is the blueprint. It is the fraction of beauty that permeates our world. We see it in the unfolding pattern of the ram's horn, in the spiral of the DNA, in the nebula and the birth of the cosmos itself. And this number is the basis of so much of what we see as beautiful in the art of the ancient Greek world. Over and over and over again, if you look at the great architecture, if you look at the statues, you will find that it conforms to this number that was said to have been discovered by Theano herself. This study of geometry, then, was not something that was meant to be left in some dry and dusty textbook. It was to be seen with your eyes, to be able to see these proportional relationships. And the art throughout the centuries, whether it is Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, or Mona Lisa, or Mondrian, or Rembrandt, all have this secret code embedded within it, as does this painting. Now, while it's called the School of Athens, we have walking down the central aisle the two figures who represent two different traditions. Plato on the one hand pointing up to the heavens saying, truth is to be found there in the world of forms. And Aristotle in the blue cloak in the center with his hand down saying, no, it is here in the world that we can see all the evidence, the scientific method. Those two tensions of two different approaches, walking, like the Pythia said, right down the middle. Right down the middle. Know thyself and never leave the middle. Now, what we see throughout the rest of this painting are the great philosophers throughout the centuries. But the person I'm going to draw your attention to is here. Because this man, holding the book that's an open book, inscribing things inside of it, surrounded by people peering over his shoulders, is Pythagoras. And what he is inscribing in this book, he is also looking at this chalkboard. And this chalkboard, if we look at these little squiggles and these lines and these archways, what we find are mathematical relationships that are actually the basis of this entire painting. So look at these archways that you see here that are upside down, and look at the archways that are an essential part and a core of this painting. This entire painting is based on Pythagorean mathematics. And Pythagoras himself is the one who is here. Now notice the figure who's holding the chalkboard. It's a woman. In fact, it's his wife, Theano, although you're not going to find, if you do find a single reference to her on any site, please let me know. Nobody has even paid any attention. She's one of those figures that nobody sees. You can go on the internet, you can find all kinds of people and diagrams telling you every single man in the picture, and they will omit the woman, the women, I should say. The other thing that she's holding here at the base is this idea of a triangle that is created by one line, and then two, and then three, and then four. This is a central symbol of the Pythagoreans known as the tetractys. And once again, if we look at it with normal eyes, all we're going to see is a triangle. But with Pythagorean eyes, this is a key that unlocks the harmony of the cosmos. Because what happens is that with this tetractys that we have here, we actually have mathematical ratios that he discovered. Pythagoras, it is said, was walking one day by a blacksmith shop, and he heard the sound of anvils. And it made this sound that caught his attention because it sounded pleasing to the ear and harmonious. And when he went to measure what was the relationship and the ratio between these hammers, what he discovered was that there was a 2-to-1 ratio. And if you have a 2-to-1 ratio, it makes this sound. So that one dot with the two dots actually has a sound that goes with it, and it's this sound. The next line of dots is 3 dots. And if you listened and you had proportionately a 3-to-2 ratio, it too makes a sound, not that sound, a sound in the cosmos. And the sound that it makes is this. 3-to-2 describes a sound. So far we have this. If we add the 4th dot and have a 4-to-3 ratio, it makes that. That triangle on the blackboard is a sound. It is a sound that is the basis of all Western music. These were called perfect intervals because they are mathematically perfect. And I wish I had a real lyre because we're actually slightly out of tune on this piano. But the real lyre would have those exact, precise mathematical ratios, and it would create a sound that would also, Pythagoras believed, tune you. That if you listen to this music that was perfectly in tune, something happens in the physiology of our being that remembers us, that like a violin tunes us up. And if we listen to music, particularly in those modes that were thought to cultivate virtue, and we hear those sounds in such a way that they are perfectly in tune, we suddenly are in tune with our souls. Now this is the basis of all music theory that emerges in the Western world. That little triangle, that tetractys then, can be seen in the relationship. If you look at the arches, those are the same relationships as the sounds I just played you. This ratio and proportion of the arches, the ratio and proportions of the sound. So you could have the same pattern, the same logos, and you could see it in nature, you could see it in architecture, you could hear it in sound. And this is a central part of the teachings that were created that one could pursue in the study of mathematics and the study of geometry, but the same pattern was throughout it all. Now, the idea in the Pythagoreans of holding this tension of the opposites, whether we call it Apollo and Dionysus, whatever we call it, the Pythagorean idea was that the world is comprised of this dynamic sense of harmony of things that are dissonant and things that are consonant, and when we hold those together, that's what gives birth to the universe. So they came up with tables and ideas about these opposing patterns, and there's all kinds of fascinating math that you can get completely lost in for days or weeks. Go see my dear friend Nancy here in the front row. She will tell you so much about all of this. But this central symbol that I want to point your attention to of holding this tension of the opposites is what is known as the Vesica Piscis, or the bladder of the whale. And it becomes this seed pattern from the mathematical geometry of this that is the genesis of so much of the great art and architecture, particularly of the medieval and Renaissance periods of Christian Europe. We find that idea of the seed pattern from which everything emerges, going from that Vesica Piscis into what is called the flower of life that permeates Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. We find it everywhere. We find it in music manuscripts, in art everywhere, everywhere, everywhere in Europe. In the 14th century, from this gorgeous manuscript here, we have an artistic depiction of a Pythagorean ideal, that the cosmos and the human being are connected, that each organ of the body is connected to something in the stars, and that each one of those is a holding together of this tension of the opposites. And in the greatest site of learning in the medieval world, Chartres Cathedral, a Christian cathedral, this is what you have over the scholar's doorway. It's that image of the Vesica Piscis. And inside, can you see who's carved inside is the figure of Jesus? But in that same doorway that the scholars would go in to study the greatest wisdom of the ancient world, what we would have in that same doorway here at Chartres Cathedral, over the royal portal to the right, is this depiction of these subjects that were known as the 7 liberal arts that one needed to see as one studied in Chartres Cathedral. Every year was dedicated to a subject. First, there was rhetoric and grammar and logic, but then guess what? You would be an inner circle person. And what would you study? You would study the very subjects that Pythagoras had taught for the Pythagoreans, what was known as the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And the idea was that you needed to be able to see the divine pattern, the logos, the fingerprint of God in each one of these things to tune your soul before you could start talking about theology. Before you could talk about God as God, you needed to be able to see where was God's DNA in mathematics? Where was it in geometry? Where was it in astronomy? Where was God's DNA in music? Because only after that process of attunement, of opening the eyes and the ears to perceive this gorgeous divine beauty that is everywhere, only then would you be fit to be a theologian. Just as in the ancient world, when the medical doctors had to have 7 years of studying music before they could see a patient, the theologians of Chartres Cathedral had to have all of these other subjects to be able to be conversant in astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music before they could get up and start preaching. Can you imagine what a different kind of world it would be with that? So those 7 liberal arts literally rest on the shoulders. Here is Pythagoras here with what is known as the monochord, as he's discovering those principles of attunement and vibration in the ancient world. Here are the images of him finding those relationships in water glasses and hammers and flutes and handbills. What is the sound that brings us into harmony? What is its relationship with mathematics. And it would take several classes to discuss this, but all of Western music is based on this. All the concepts of harmony that some of you might have been tortured with, of perfect fourths and perfect fifths and perfect octaves, come from this quest to see the sacred in everything around us. This whole idea of mathematics and music came together in the most extraordinary way. And we have the Pythagorean legacy throughout the centuries. This is a 17th century image called the lyre of God, in which God's hand is reaching out to tune the pegboard like of a violin. And what you see on that pegboard are on the one side all the notes, and on the other earth, air, fire, water, and all the planets. And then in the archways, the relationship between the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth, the perfect eighth. It is one vision, one vision. And those relationships that move from math to geometry to music to astronomy was thought to be the basis of wisdom, stretching from the Pythagoreans all the way through the centuries. This is a fantastic image called the Temple of Music. You can see a little lute in the cornerstone. And this actually shows you the relationship between numbers and musical notes and musical rests and architecture. It's all the same thing. It was said to be, a great cathedral was said to be frozen music. And when you walk through that door that Pythagoras is looking over at you, there's Jesus, there's Pythagoras, you walk in the door. What you see here is an expression of the divine mathematics that permeate the entire cosmos. Even the labyrinth itself here has its link to Pythagoras. This is a French medieval manuscript called the Invocation of Pythagoras. Music and math and geometry all together. The end goal of the Pythagorean community was that you would be so in tune through your practices of silence and study that you would actually finally be able to hear that you were part of a divine song. That there are vibrations that are so subtle that go out all through the planets. It was believed that every planet has its note, and together it creates a symphony. But we're just too deaf and distracted to hear it because we're so busy with the world, busy doing this, busy doing that we don't have the time to tune ourselves. And it's like a transistor radio where you're trying to search and find a station, and there's so much static in our daily life that you can't get the signal. But what the Pythagoreans believed was that if you searched for this DNA print in everything, in silence, in music, that you could quiet the mind enough. And then you would finally be able to hear that all the planets, all the stars are singing to you, are singing to you. This idea of the music of the spheres was one that has stretched forth. It becomes the basis for Dante's Paradiso in the Divine Comedy. We find it in the music and the illuminations and the artwork of Hildegard of Bingen. We find it in the scientific search of Copernicus and Kepler. But all of those were expressions of one idea, the idea that comes from the man with the chalkboard who I was tortured by in geometry class. Thank you.